Okay, well, I have 6 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody to tonight's Ag in the Evening program. Thank you for joining us. The topic tonight will be breeding season considerations, and we'll talk about some considerations for the breeding season and what impact they may have on calving season, marketing considerations, and some other things as well. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Jason Bant. I'm the Extension Beef Cattle Specialist stationed at Overton. All right, so the first thing I wanted to start with is what are some benefits of a defined breeding season, or for some people, may have more than one breeding season per year. One of the big benefits is from a labor standpoint. And so when we think about how frequently we check cattle, most people are going to check cattle more frequently during the calving season than they would at during the rest of the year. So if you're calving year round, you never know when those cows are calving. So that leads to checking those cows more frequently, or maybe a little less efficiency from a labor standpoint. When we think about processing cattle from a vaccine standpoint on those calves, or if we're castrating those calves or anything else we're doing at processing time, as well as when we get ready to ship those calves to market, if we have a defined breeding season so that we have defined calving seasons, it makes it much easier to get people to help, and we're not having to ask people as often to help with some of those procedures if we do need some outside help, whether it's from family members or other people. From a weaning standpoint, it's a whole lot easier to wean calves only once or twice a year rather than weaning them multiple times through the year. And often, if you have a year-round calving season, you just may decide it's more trouble than it's worth to wean those calves, and so that limits marketing opportunities for you as well. And so there's a lot of benefits from a labor standpoint to having a defined breeding season. A lot of those benefits also roll over to benefits from a marketing standpoint. And so a big benefit is, depending on how you're set up, you may be able to set your breeding season so that those calves will calve, and then you can wean them when we typically are in the seasonal market highs. And so if we think about winter calves normally born across the entire United States, most of the calves in the United States are going to be born February, March, April, and May. And so that means those calves are going to be sold in the fall. And so just from a supply and demand standpoint, price for 5-weight calves or 4-weight calves or even 6-weight calves, calves in that weight range are going to be lower in the fall typically than they will be at any other time of the year. And that's just because there's more calves being supplied to the market at that point in time. In contrast, calves that are born in the fall will typically be sold, if they're sold at 400, 500, 600 pounds, those calves are going to be sold in the spring, late, May or early summer there, April, May, early June. That's typically where we see a seasonal high for that size of calf. And so there are some advantages, if you have calves born all throughout the year, some of those calves are going to be sold on the seasonal high of the market, and some of those calves are typically going to be sold on the seasonal low. So just kind of recap that, from a 400 to 600 pound steer or heifer, we're typically talking about high prices, April, May, maybe early June. When we talk about 4 to 6 weight calves, seasonal low will typically be in the fall, September, October, maybe early November. Now that varies a little bit from year to year, but we tend to see that pattern. Now, if we're talking about bigger calves, so let's say you kept those calves past weaning and you grew them through the stocker phase, and so now you're selling a 750, 800 pound calf, the seasonal high for those will typically be in the early fall. So September, October, November time frame. So it really depends on what size calf we're talking about marketing as far as when that seasonal high is. Having a defined breeding season typically means we're going to have less trips to the auction market if we're taking them to the auction market. It's also going to make it much easier to participate in a preconditioned calf sale where we have to wean those calves, typically at least 60 days. It used to be 45 days for a lot of the sales, but the last couple of years, most of the preconditioned calf sales have increased that from 45 to 60 days. And so if we have all the calves being born together, it just makes that process much easier. For those producers who are running more cows, they have the potential then, if they have a defined breeding season, to put together truckload lots of calves, which has a price premium typically associated with it. And we can have more uniformity in those calves, which also will have an additional small premium if we're talking about selling in load lots. And then another advantage to selling in load lots is you can sell those calves to be delivered in the future. So right now, those of you who are familiar with Superior Livestock Auction, that's one of the three main video auction companies in the United States. So, and they would be the biggest. So you have Superior Video, you have Northern Video, and you have Western. Superior is having one of their big, what they call summer calf sales. So they call it the Week in the Rockies. So they'll actually sell calves on video all this week, Monday through Friday. I actually took a snapshot earlier today. They were selling some feeder heifers. These heifers were weighing 800 pounds. And when I took the screenshot this morning, the bid was 240. I think those heifers ended up selling for $242. And they're scheduled to be delivered the 1st through the 15th of September. So we're sitting here in July, but they're selling those calves that won't be delivered until later. And so one advantage of doing that is if you can sell in load lots, is it gives you more time to market those calves. And so let's say you consigned them to a sale today and maybe the market wasn't quite as good. You could PO those calves. They've never left your property, and then you could put them on another sale later on when the market may be better. If they did sell well today, like the market was pretty strong, then you actually get what they call a part pay, or you can think of it as a down payment a little bit on that contract to give you a little bit of money or cash flow until you sell or until you deliver those calves, I should say, later this year. The other thing having a defined breeding season does is if it opens you up to retain ownership of those calves through a stocker phase if you want. So you can wean those calves, and then if you have plenty of grass, you can go ahead and hold on and graze those calves. And so maybe you wean them when they're 650 pounds, but you put an additional 150 or 200 pounds on them and sell them when they're weighing 758, maybe even 850 pounds. And so that allows you to capture some more value on those calves. Retain those calves through a stocker phase is extremely valuable. Anytime corn prices are high, feedlots are more willing to pay you more money as a cow-calf producer to put weight on those calves through a grass program. And so, especially when corn prices are high, it's very advantageous to hold on to those calves if you have good grass. It can also be advantageous even when the corn market is a little weaker. And then when we think about managing the nutritional requirements of the cow herd, so if we just look at nutritional requirements between mature lactating cows and then mature dry cows. So if you look to the right here, a mature lactating cow at peak lactation, which would be about 60 days after calving, if we let her eat all the forage or all the hay she's going to need a diet that's roughly about 12.5% protein, 61% TDN. If we compare that to a dry cow about 2 weeks before calving, she's only about 8.5% protein, 55% TDN. If we even took that a step further and said a mature dry cow a few months before calving, she would be even lower on TDN there. And so I point that out that if we're sitting there during the winter and you have lactating cows mixed in there with dry cows, so you have cows at all stages of lactation, you're going to have to feed to meet the nutrient requirements of those lactating cows. And so that means you're always going to be overfeeding the rest of the cows in the bunch. So having that defined breeding season, we can do a better job on our supplementation program and make that more economical. So what are some time of year considerations when we think about breeding and calving season? So the first thing is, when should you calve? Well, it's really going to depend on the type of operation you have, your local climatic conditions, thinking nationally here, and then how's your forage program set up and designed? There'll be some other factors, but those are going to be three big ones. So type of operation, are you a commercial producer that's selling calves at weaning, or maybe you're selling feeder calves that are weighing a little bit more? Are you a seed stock producer that's selling bulls? And if you're a seed stock producer that's selling bulls, you may want to have those bulls a little older than when you get ready to sell them. So even though commercial producers around you may typically be calving at a certain time of year, you may be a month or two earlier than that, or you may want to be 6 months earlier than that, just depending on what's going to work best for your bull market. If you're a producer who's looking at selling beef directly to somebody, so you're selling carcasses, or maybe you're going to the local farmers market and you're actually selling individual cuts. Well, in that situation, it would be beneficial to have a supply of cattle getting ready throughout the year. And so in that situation, rather than just having one breeding and calving season, it may be beneficial to have two breeding and calving seasons, even though one of them may not match perfectly from a forage standpoint for you. To help keep your supply spread throughout the year, that may be something you would want to do. If you're in the show calf business, depending on whether you're talking about show steers or show heifers, that may change the time of year you need to calve there. Climate's a big one, and most of what I'm going to focus on today is in relation to commercial producers. And so weather is going to be huge, and we'll talk about that in more detail on the coming slides. And that's really going to depend on where you're located at, as far as what may be a good time of year to have those calves born, and what may not be as favorable. And then forage program can have an impact there, and especially when we think about fall calving operations. And so fall calving operations have an advantage. A lot of people like that because you're typically selling those calves or selling those feeder cattle on the seasonal high of the market. But to make a fall calving program work, you need to have a good cool season annual forage program. So a good ryegrass program, wheat, oats, something like that. If you don't, you're probably going to spend more money in additional supplementation on those fall calving cows. That's going to offset what that sale premium would have been. Typically, if we're just thinking about it generally, we want to have those calves born 1 to 2 months before we have an abundant high quality forage supply. So if your best forage supply is going to be April and May, we want to have those calves born a month or two before that typically. So what are some things we want to think about during weather extremes? So we will see increased morbidity of newborn calves during extremely hot or extremely cold weather. So if we have calves born in extremely cold weather down here, and unfortunately we've had that happen a couple of times with some extreme weather events we've had over the last couple of years, we do lose a few more of those calves compared to normal. Same thing if it's extremely hot, and that's why for most of Texas we want to avoid summer calving, as we will see increased loss of those summer born calves. Had a lot of producers that were calving kind of late August, 1st of September, especially back in 2011, that lost more calves than normal. The other thing is, even if we don't lose those calves born during the real hot part of the summer often just don't do quite as well. Even if we don't lose calves during cold weather, we can see frostbite of ears and tails of those calves during extreme cold, where we may lose the outer part of the ear, or we may lose the bottom part of the tail, or you may end up seeing just kind of a white ring of hair around the tips of those ears. For the much of Texas and really the southern United States, especially the southeastern United States, we want to avoid summer calving that hot, humid weather is just not good for those baby calves. They just don't perform well. Now, if we just look at Texas, there is a part of Texas, especially when we get out in parts of West Texas, that are affected by a monsoon rain pattern and maybe at a little higher elevation, or the middle of summer, because of the way their forage is produced and they have cool enough temperatures, may actually be one of the better times to have calves born then. So you really have to look at your environment. And then in northern climates, we're trying to avoid the winter for obvious reasons there. Some breeding considerations during hot weather is during the heat of the summer, we will see reduced fertility in both the bulls and in the females. And we'll look at some data on the bulls here in just a second. The other thing is during the heat of the summer is oftentimes you won't see breeding activity occur during the day. It'll occur at night. So that's something to be mindful of. Just when you're checking cattle, you will see differences throughout the year with breeding activity depending on temperature. The other thing is during the summer, especially if we're further west in really big pastures, is those bulls may not search as far as for those cows when we're talking about hot weather there. You can see here these bulls seeking out some heat stress relief in the ponds there during the summer. And so obviously they're not breeding cows, and we're probably affecting fertility in that situation as well. So this is some work done out of Oklahoma State where they looked at fertility in bulls based on either a heat stress group or a group that we would call thermoneutral, meaning no heat stress. So in the heat stress group, and they expose these bulls to these temperatures for 8 weeks, is 16 hours of the day, they kept temperature at 88 degrees Fahrenheit. And then for the last 8 hours of the day at 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So nothing really that unusual for what we'll see for a large part of the middle of the summer and late summer in Texas. And then the thermoneutral group with no heat stress, they were at 73 degrees Fahrenheit there. So what this graph is, give me just a second to set it up, is on the left-hand side is motility of that sperm. So percentage of those sperm that are moving. The higher the number is going to be better here. And this is when a breeding soundness exam was done. And so if you see when we start, the control group is the black dots. The heat stress group is the black triangles. And so at the start of the experiment, both groups were the same on motility, and that's what we would expect. But you see, as we go through that first 8 weeks, those on the control stayed pretty consistent, which is what we would expect. But those bulls that were exposed to heat stress, you can see over time, less and less of those sperm were motile. And if those sperm aren't motile, they're not going to be able to fertilize that egg. Then you can see even after the heat stress was stopped, and that's what I indicated with the orange line here, it takes several weeks for those bulls to get back to normal that were in that heat stress group. So once we have heat stress and it's impacted sperm function, it takes a while before everything gets back to normal. And the reason being is to go from when that sperm cells start to being produced until it's ready to fertilize that egg, typically is going to take about 61 days there. And so that's why you have part of that delay there. And you can see that delay was roughly about 8 weeks. So if we think 8 weeks, 56 days, I mentioned it takes about 61 for that sperm cell to go from beginning until it's ready to fertilize that egg. If we look at what we call morphology, or the percent of those sperm cells are normal, meaning they don't have any kind of abnormalities that would reduce fertility as well. And again, on the vertical axis, the higher the number, the better. And so you can see we saw that big drop in motility on the previous slide, but we also see a drop in morphology here as we see some more damage to those sperm cells in that heat stress group. So next kind of area I want to spend a little time talking about is how long should a breeding season be and what are some various advantages and disadvantages there. But before we get in that, the first thing I want to set up, and this is something as an industry we have to be mindful of. It's something we cover in all of our BQA or beef quality assurance trainings, is abortions and unplanned baby calves and feedlots are not BQA best management practices. And there's a whole lot more heifers that arrive in a feedlot pregnant, unfortunately, than what people realize. So that has to do with how we manage our breeding seasons or how we manage marketing those heifers if we don't have a breeding season in place. To just kind of illustrate this point even more, I was looking at the NetBio website one day, and they had actually posted after their July sale in 2021 that they had, just from that one sale, heifers that were sold as feeder heifers that should have been open. 34 of those heifers that were sold that day were returned back to the sale because they were bred. And I'm sure there was more than that that didn't get returned back to the NetBio sale because of that. And that's not an isolated incident. There's even more of that that's going on. But these are calves that people were even doing a little extra management on. So really, to make sure we reduce the risk of these nursing heifers getting bred by herd bulls, and yes, that 18 to 2,200 pound herd bull will breed that 6 or 7 month old heifer if she comes into heat, and more of those heifers come into heat than what people realize. So to help reduce the risk of those heifers that are still nursing that cow from getting bred, we really need to make sure that breeding season is not any longer than 90 days. And just kind of wanted to illustrate how that works and why we kind of want to shoot for no more than 90 days. So let's think about if we turned a bull out on April 5th and removed him on July 4th, that would be 90 days there. When are those calves going to be born? Okay. So some of those calves will actually be born a little before the breeding or before the predicted first date of the breeding season, because not all calves go to 280 or 285 days of gestation. Some of them come a little early, and then some of them will come a little late. So if we say we started with the 90-day breeding season, theoretically, it's very realistic to end up with a 110-day calving season. So that first calf would be born around January 5th, the last one there about April 25th, assuming we had a cow bred on the last day of the breeding season, which we may not. We're more worried about those that are calving early in the season. So in this scenario, if that's when we turn the bulls out and that's when those calves started being born, the oldest calf, all right, when we remove the bull, so remove the bull July 4th, if that first calf was born on January 5th, when we remove the bull on July 4th this next year, that oldest calf would be 180 days old. And so we definitely don't want those calves any older than that. The older those heifer calves are going to be, the greater the chance of them potentially getting bred by the bull. Now, a 90-day breeding season doesn't eliminate that, but it does greatly reduce our risk there. Okay. And you say, well, why not just wait till you wean? If we think about that, we're not weaning for typically a pretty good while. Some of those heifers may be 7 or 8 months of age or a little older when we wean it, when we're talking about those heifers born, especially at the beginning of the breeding season. So that's kind of why we shoot for no more than a 90-day breeding season. So let's say you do have a year-round calving season and you decide you want to convert that to a defined breeding and calving season. What's the easiest way to do that? What I would suggest for most people is just go ahead and pick you some dates and let's do a 90-day breeding season in the spring and a 90-day breeding season in the fall, rather than just saying we went from 365 to just 90 days. If we go to just 90 days, well, that's a quick way to do it. You're going to have more open cows in that situation, and that's going to be a little harder to manage from a cash flow standpoint and managing expenses. So if we just go from 365 to two 90-day seasons, that still covers 180 days of the year. And really, typically, we're not moving a cow more than about 90 days in that situation. And then you may decide to keep both a spring and fall, or over time, you can just make sure you don't add any more to one of those seasons and just kind of let it work its way out over time. Or a year or two down the road, just go ahead and roll those. Let's say you wanted to have a spring season, just take those fall calving females and roll them into the spring. So that's kind of a way to manage that, is just start with two calving seasons and then either roll one after some time or just discontinue one of those herds over time. So you hear some people talk about a 45-day or a 60-day breeding season. Well, what's the advantages of that versus a 90-day breeding season? And the first thing I want to really get everybody to think about is the length of the breeding season and the length of the calving season likely will not be the same. So you can have a 90-day breeding season and still have the majority, if not all, those calves born in the first 45 days of that calving season. So personally, I'm not a big proponent when you hear people talk about, well, they want to go to a 45 or 60. If you want to do that, that's fine, but that's not something I'm going to recommend, because I can still keep a really tight calving window, even though I have that longer breeding season. And what's nice about having that 90-day breeding season is if I have a cow or two that gets bred right at the beginning of the breeding season and then slips that pregnancy, which will happen. It happens more than what people realize. She still has a chance to go ahead and get bred back before that breeding season is over if I'm running 90 days versus if I'm just running 45 or 60. So we can still have that tight calving window, even though we may keep the bulls out a little bit longer, but no longer than 90 days. And that's just really comes to personal preference. When we look at what would be common calving seasons in East Texas or Central Texas, late winter is probably the most common. So looking kind of that January, February timeframe. Spring is also very common, and then fall works good as well. So let's say you wanted to start calving in the fall, and I'm going to tell you personally, in our family operation in Central Texas, we do calve in the fall. I used to start calving around September 15th. Over the last few years, we've kind of delayed that to start calving closer to October 1, and that's just from a temperature standpoint, and especially starting to see a little shorter gestation depending on the breed of bull that gets used there. So personally, I have delayed that back to October 1 rather than September 15th, and especially compared to September 1. September 1, it can still be really hot then. If you did want to start calving around October 1st, then we would look at turning those bulls out right after Christmas there, approximately the 27th. And figuring these dates, I was figuring a 279-day gestation length. We'll talk about that here in a minute. If you wanted to kind of look more at a February 1st calving window to start, then we would look at turning those bulls out, for example, around the end of April in that situation. So what do we do with the bulls when they're not out with those cows during the breeding season? And that's a big concern a lot of people have. I'm going to tell you, it's not as much trouble to deal with those bulls a lot of times as what you may think if you haven't done it before. After a few weeks away from those cows, those bulls tend to settle down. They're not bellowing or walking fences or stuff anymore. And since you should have those cows bred, there's no cows coming into heat that they're worried about. An electric fence works really good. So if you have a smaller pasture on a portion of the property, if you'll just put an electric fence on top or midway up on that permanent fence, that does a really good job to keep those bulls from testing those fences and staying where they need to. I know some producers that are really comfortable with electric fences. They're probably going to run more than one strand, but they may use nothing more than just an electric fence to keep the bulls away from the heifers. That wouldn't be my recommendation starting out for most people, but people do that and it works fine for them. My recommendation would be just find a pasture with a permanent fence and then just add an electric fence to it. Another thing you may consider doing, and there's a couple advantages to this. So after we wean those calves, we could go ahead and turn the bull or bulls back in with the cows until that first cow calves again. What that lets us do is pick up any open cows that may have slipped after they were bred, or maybe they didn't come into heat during the breeding season for whatever reason. Then the next calving season, although they're not going to have a calf, it would give you the opportunity to market a bred female rather than an open female in that situation. But we're only going to kick those bulls back in there from weaning to when that first calf is born. And so that's a couple more months. And so if you're worried about missing out on some cows getting bred, you could still have a defined breeding season and a defined calving season, but kick those bulls back in for a few months to pick up any opens in that situation. The other thing is that may make management a little bit easier for you from a pasture rotation standpoint or something like that. So something just to think about there. So what are some other things to consider? Realize that gestation length will vary by breed. Angus recently kind of did an evaluation of their data, and on average, what they were seeing was about 279 days. If we look at Brahman in contrast, we're looking at a gestation length of 292. So I know a lot of times we talk about maybe 283 days or 285 days, and that's kind of the average across breeds, but we do see quite a bit of variation around that. The other thing to remember is if you're kind of setting your breeding season up, and especially if you're breeding heifers and you want them to calve at a certain point, realize those calving ease bulls, typically we see a little shorter gestation length on them. So be aware of that if you're breeding a lot of heifers. And then we may see some differences with gestation length depending on whether we're talking about fall calving or spring calving. With fall calving, sometimes we do see those calves born a few days early compared to what they would be born in the spring. And that has to do with temperature in that situation. If you look at the bottom right, this was some data put together by a beef cattle specialist out of Nevada several years ago when he looked at 140 Angus cows, and he kind of broke them into different groups, starting at 272 days here, going to ones that didn't calve till 284 days. And you can see that average right there, but we do see some variation around that average. In some situations, I mentioned it earlier, some people like having 2 calving seasons. If we're talking about really large operations where they have enough calves where they have multiple load lots they could sell, there could be an advantage to having both a spring and a fall calving season. Just from a bull standpoint, you could cut the number of bulls you needed in half in that situation. There may also be some labor benefits. So during calving season, you could spread that labor out a little bit better so you wouldn't have as many cows calving at one point in time to check. And so there may be some advantages there. From a forage management standpoint, there would be some disadvantages. One of those calving seasons likely is not going to match the forage base quite as favorably, but just some things to consider depending on the operation. During the breeding season, you want to make sure you take a note. If you see a cow get bred or a cow that's in heat, just write that cow down and make sure 18 to 21 days later, which is typically when 21 is when they'll typically come in back into heat, but I'd start watching at least 18 days. after and see if that cow comes back into heat. Because if you're seeing a bunch of cows that were in heat and then they come back into heat, that tells you probably have some kind of problem going on. And so it can let you identify those problems and get them fixed much quicker there. If you see those cows come into heat and then they don't come back into heat, that's a good sign everything's going like it's supposed to. Just remember during the breeding season, we really don't want to mix older bulls with bulls that are 1 or 2 years old. Mixing those older bulls and younger bulls together tends to see a few more injuries in that situation. And those younger bulls really aren't going to do any breeding in that situation. Make sure during the breeding season you are watching for injured bulls to make sure you don't have any problem there. And then the other thing to be mindful of during the breeding season is pastures that border with neighbors. If their breeding season is going on at the same time, if you can keep your group of cows away from their group of cows, just to help prevent any fighting through the fences of those bulls. That's something to consider. Sometimes you can't, but if you can rotate pastures and communicate with your neighbors where y'all do that, that can be beneficial for both parties there. If you're in the seed stock business and so you're not castrating all those bull calves at 3 months of age or younger, and you're going to keep some of them to sell for breeding purposes, in that situation, we really want to probably separate the bull calf pairs from the heifer calf pairs once they get older than a few months of age. Some of those bull calves, when they reach 6, 7, 8 months of age, depending on genetics, can produce functional sperm and can breed those heifers or maybe even breed some of the cows in the group. We will see typically some weaning weight differences between fall and spring barn calves. So if you have a good winter pasture program in place with ryegrass or wheat or oats, those fall barn calves will typically be 50 to 75 pounds heavier than what similar spring barn calves would be. And that just is due to the advantage in forage quality there. Also, those fall calving cows tend to be in a little better condition than spring calving cows. But to make fall calving work, we have to have a good winter pasture program. Another benefit of having a defined breeding season is it makes it much easier from a vaccine management standpoint to time that vaccine for the cows in the operation, and also much easier to identify any potential reproductive health problems, whether that's something like trick or some other venereal disease in that situation. If we don't have a defined calving season, it makes it a little harder to pick up those drops in pregnancy rates and those kind of things. So that's what I wanted to cover. Hopefully that gives you some things to think about as you're trying to decide what you should do from a breeding season and calving season standpoint in your operation, and be happy to answer any questions anybody has. Feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat box or go ahead and unmute and ask those questions. So somebody went ahead and unmuted. So William, if you have a question, go ahead.
Could you go back to that last slide?
Question or a point you wanted me to kind of expand on?
Well, I just wanted to look at those last 2 points.
And so what I mean from a vaccine management standpoint is when we think about giving a cow a clostridial vaccine, which a lot of people refer to that as a blackleg vaccine, but blackleg is only one component of the clostridial vaccine, is we really want to do that a few months before calving if we can, because that's going to help improve the quality of colostrum that calf's going to get later on. But even more important than that, when we think about vaccines like Lepto or Vibrio or IBR or BVD that impact reproduction in those cows, we really want to time those vaccines prior to the breeding season. And so if we have cows that are calving all throughout the year, it makes that very difficult to time that Lepto, Vibrio, IBR, BVD the way we want. Whereas if we have that defined breeding season, it makes that much easier. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right, well, I'm not seeing any additional comments or questions. So again, just want to thank everybody for joining tonight.